Hello everybody. Now today I wanted to have a look at some potential pairings that could be used for the comparison question for the poetry paper for GCSE English Literature on the Eduqas board. Now first of all I wanted to have a look at some potential questions that could come up. Now all of these have been printed in the Eduqas guide for teachers and students, and some of these have actually been used quite recently on recit papers, such as the top one on power in Ozymandias. Now obviously this comes with a bit of a disclaimer because we can never really predict what questions will come up, so obviously the only sound advice that we can give is to revise everything, because they might throw a curveball, they might repeat a question or something along those lines. But if you have an idea of what you could write about for each of these questions, then you pretty much have most bases covered. So like I said, that first one on power has come up quite recently. The passing of time in afternoons, that's an interesting one. So almost like the negative effects of time passing and summer fading, as Larkin puts it. That would be a good one to compare with Ozymandias, I think. Relationships in Cozy Apologia. Relationships came up as a theme not that long ago in relation to afternoons. Compare the presentation of growing up. So that's an interesting one. Kind of linked there also to the theme of transience and the passing of time. Nature and to autumn. That's come up as a kind of specimen paper before. Place in London. Death in Mammoth's Wood. Compare how the poets use the sonnet form in Sonnet 43 and a chosen poem. Now that's a little bit of a curveball of a question that could arise, and I will speak through that in a second. We also have love in Valentine. We've done one similar to that, I'm sure, before. Beauty in She Walks in Beauty. Now that's quite a difficult one because one is about the beauty of a person. I can only really think of other poems to do with the beauty of landscape and surroundings. Perhaps the prelude to autumn or something along those lines. War in Dulce, and then feelings in As Imperceptibly as Grief. Now what I wanted to do based on these questions is to go through three potential pairings. So I'm going to have a look at place, I'm going to have a look at the sonnet form as a little bit of an out there one, and also I'm going to have a look at growing up and the idea of growing up and childhood. So first of all, if we start with place. Now this question here says place in London. Now I think an easy comparison here would be to living space. Now bear in mind that this theme of place could come up in relation to the prelude or something like that, but I think London and living space is the best comparison that you could make here. Now London is pretty much an unflinching portrayal of life in industrial London, okay? And as we know, Blake feels this overwhelming sense of despair about life in the city. We see this use of anaphora of the words in every, highlighting this kind of sense that everybody in the city is affected, be it the infants, be it the soldiers, be it the chimney sweepers, be it the youthful harlots. There is this sense of overwhelming despair that's portrayed in those lines. There is also this very striking metaphor of the mind-forged manacles, okay? Now this implies that everybody in a sense is restricted by the city and restricted by their own thoughts. Notice that verb forged there is quite clever really, because Blake is quite critical of the industrialization of London. And really what we get in this poem is a journey. Blake takes us on a journey throughout the city. Blake openly attacks institutions of power such as the monarchy and the blackening church for what he deemed as their failure to look after the poor and the destitute of London. Okay, Blake himself, he was religious, but he was very unorthodox in his beliefs, and he distrusted organised religion. He viewed organised religion as a corrupt force. So this image of the blackening church is a really important one when we think about place and when we think about these buildings as representing these institutions of power. Blackening, this metaphor really has two meanings to it. One, there is a literal blackening from the pollution and the smog of industrialization, and two, there is a kind of moral stain on the church for its failure to look after the poor. We also have the image of the blood of the soldiers running down palace walls. So Blake really views these buildings, these buildings, as representative of institutions of power. Blake focuses, as I've mentioned, on different pockets of society. Okay, the chimney sweepers, the soldiers, the harlots, and as he goes on this journey, he makes quite extensive use of sensory language. He tries to paint a vivid picture of his surroundings through his use of sensory language. We get lots of I hear, we get the voice, we get the sighs, okay, we get the cries towards the end. There is a simple alternating A-B rhyme scheme to kind of reflect this relentless misery, and it's almost a kind of childlike nursery rhyme. Remember, London was from a collection called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. It is a song of experience. So this sort of nursery rhyme, childlike form of the poem contrasts quite heavily with the quite distressing and weighty content to the poem. So it's dealing with very serious issues, but the form is quite simplistic and quite childlike. And Blake, as a final kind of contextual point, is considered very much an anti-authoritarian, somebody who in the true romantic tradition rebels against authority. And in contrast then, unlike the kind of relentless, overwhelming sense of misery we see in London, there is a tentative sense of hope in Living Space, and this is symbolized by the eggs and what she describes as their fragile curves of white. Now, this hope and faith that we see in the eggs is thin, it's brittle, it's fragile, and this shows that hope in this setting is easily breakable. Darker also kind of alludes to wider corruption in society through this metaphor that she describes as the slanted universe. So in some ways, this is a kind of point of comparison between the two. They both look at life in the city, and they both allude to a sense of corruption and inequality. Now, Darker primarily focuses on the precarious nature of the slum houses and the buildings. Notice this line here: the beams balance crookedly, and we've got this line that it leads dangerously towards the miraculous. That she's almost in awe that these buildings are able to keep upright and keep their shape almost in such kind of precarious and perilous conditions. Now notice this line, beams balance crookedly. There's a lot to speak about in this line, because there's alliteration which kind of draws the beams together, but it's split over two lines. So there's enjambment and there's also alliteration together, which kind of sums up the tension in the poem, which is between kind of order and instability. So if we move on to form now, this is written in free verse, which is again is a very good point of comparison to London. Okay, free verse meaning that it has no regular rhyme or structure. There is frequent enjambment. There's quite an irregular line length, which kind of reflects again this instability of the slum housing. Now there are little pockets of rhyme all throughout the poem, which do show some semblance of order throughout. So seams and beams, for example. And you are probably aware that there is this very much this shorter stanza, okay, that is, to quote the poem, squeezed in between the other two, which is, again, reflective of the squeeze of the houses and the disorder of the slum housing. And this is where these two eggs are placed in that wire basket. So quite a lot of points of comparison there between these two poems. So again, darker, mainly focusing on the kind of precarious nature of the buildings, whereas Blake, in terms of his place, associates these buildings with institutions of power, such as the monarchy and the church. Okay, let's move on to the theme of growing up, and let's start with the prelude. Now, this is an excerpt from a much larger autobiographical poem that explores the relationship between humans and nature. It is written from the perspective of an adult looking back nostalgically at their childhood memories. Wordsworth himself was born in the Lake District, so he was used to being surrounded by rural, what we would call in literature, pastoral settings. Okay, so looking at kind of nature, the landscape, the countryside. And at the beginning of the poem, the narrator, the youthful narrator, rebels. He does not pay attention to the fact that the village clock is at 6 o'clock, and he does not go home and instead chooses to go out to play. So as it says here, he heeded not the summons that it was late and decided to go out and play and have what he describes as a happy time. Now, at the first section of this poem, Wordsworth uses an extensive range of verbs such as wheeled and flew to show this sense of youthful energy, exuberance and excitement. And this simile here, like an untired horse, reinforces this sense of youthful enthusiasm and energy. And notice how this simile also connects humans with the natural world, in this case horses. But there is a clear volta in this poem. There is a shift from people and play to a more reflective focus on nature. And at the end of the poem, the adult Wordsworth reflects on nature and suggests that although we, as we grow older, we become more aware of nature and aware of our surroundings and perhaps more appreciative of our surroundings, he says that nature also has an alien sound of melancholy. Now, this word alien and suggests a kind of sense of the unfamiliar, the unknown, and this kind of this feeling of melancholy that accompanies it suggests that humans ultimately, despite being growing more appreciative of nature, are ultimately distanced from it. Now, this volta, this shift, is something that's also shared in The Death of a Naturalist. So, as you are probably aware, at the start of this poem is essentially, again, a childhood reflection on a nostalgic reflection, and the poet remembers how they used to collect frog spawn from the flax dam. The narrator is initially really enthusiastic about this, and this is shown through the use of childlike language and lexis. So he lists, for example, all the creatures, and then says, but best of all, in an almost enthusiastic way, but best of all was the frog spawn. And he uses these words like mammy frog, daddy frog, and also kind of coined words like jam potfuls when he's referring to how much frog spawn he's collecting. There are also references to school. So he talks about Miss Walls and how she almost educates him on frog spawn and how to collect it and what to do. So there is an initial enthusiasm for nature there, similar to the kind of energy and youthful energy that we see in the prelude. But as in the prelude, this kind of childhood curiosity shifts in the second stanza to a feeling of dread, and an almost threatening feeling of dread. And Heaney does this by using a lot of military imagery and military language to describe the frogs. And this creates obviously a very threatening atmosphere. So he uses this simile here that they are poised like mud grenades. He uses the word that they invaded the flax dam now. They were no longer a benign force, they are now a sort of hostile force. And he also calls them slime kings as well. And there is almost a shift in the attitude towards nature here. Okay, it says that the older Heaney turned and ran away from the flax-stam in fear. And the poem ends with a very striking image as the narrator fears that the frog spawn may clutch his hand if he ever kind of put his hand into the jars. And remember, this is something he used to do very regularly as a youth, but now, as he grows older, as time passes, nature becomes unfamiliar and threatening. So remember, the idea of growing up is also very, very much tied into the passing of time and the theme of transience. And if we think about the poem's title, there is almost a juxtaposition in the poem's title: the death of a naturalist. This shows how, over time, as he grows up, the narrator, Heaney's attitude towards nature has changed. So finally, moving on to looking at the sonnet form. Now, I think we can all admit that this would be a bit of a tricky question. Now, there are 3 sonnets in the anthology. Sonnet 43, The Soldier, and Ozymandias, that's actually written in a quite clever sonnet form to mirror the kind of passing of time. However, I do think that a comparison between Sonnet 43 and The Soldier would probably be the most apt for this, as they both use the sonnet form to convey different ideas and different meanings. Now, Sonnet 43 is kind of uses the sonnet form as it traditionally should be used, as a love poem to a particular person. And this is written in what's called the Petrarchan sonnet form, and it's written to convey her love for fellow poet Robert Browning. Now, this is one of 44 sonnets dedicated to him, which kind of shows the intensity of their love. She actually eloped against her parents' wishes with Robert Browning, which again shows the intensity of their love and just how important their love was to her. Now, the poem is actually written in a quite personal fashion. It's written in the first person. The pronoun I is used frequently, which makes the poem seem really quite personal and almost autobiographical. And it is also written in iambic pentameter, which is there to kind of mimic the rhythm and flow of natural speech. However, this is somewhat disrupted, particularly towards the end of the poem, as there is extensive use of listing and caesura and pauses that are there to show sort of excitement and breathlessness and passion all intertwined together. Even at the start, after she kind of reels off the rhetorical question, "How do I love thee?" we immediately see a list, which sort of disrupts the kind of rhythm and flow of natural speech. But it's there to show this sense of passion and excitement. So, thinking about the structure of the poem as well, it begins with a rhetorical question: "How do I love thee?" And then it essentially is followed by a range of answers to that question. So the sonnet form is used in its traditional sense to as a kind of dedication and as a traditional love poem towards somebody. But structurally, if we think about the way the ideas are sequenced, it's pretty much structured in a question and answer format. There is also frequent repetition and anaphora of the phrase "I love thee," which creates almost like a refrain, a chorus, and this reflects that of a prayer. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning hopes that God will support their love and suggests at the end that it's eternal, pure and virtuous. So these lines: "And if God choose, I shall love thee better after death." And she sort of rhymes these ideas of breath and death to make it seem like their love will last forever, okay, even after death, that it's something that's eternal, pure and long lasting. Okay, on the flip side then, Rupert Brooke subverts the traditional sonnet form to write about his love for his country. Okay, whereas in Barrett Browning's poem, the object of the love is a person, here it is England rather than a person. And really, he uses the sonnet form as almost a love letter to his country and to the soldier's cause in World War One. The use of the sonnet form and the frequent repetition of England and English elevates his thoughts and his emotions rather, and shows how strong they are. England dominates his thoughts. It's always on his mind. England throughout the sonnet is also personified as a motherly and nursing and almost godlike figure. The speaker says that he feels blessed to have been born and to have been shaped and made aware by England. And there is almost this kind of idyllic image of the English heaven with flowers and rivers. The first octave, now this is some more nuanced points about form. The first octave is written in as a Shakespearean sonnet, which then shifts to a Petrarchan sonnet in the last 6 lines in the sestet. And this perhaps represents the soldier's final resting place in what he describes as a foreign field. So there is a shift from the Shakespearean sonnet, which is described as the English sonnet, to a Petrarchan Italian, more foreign sonnet, perhaps indicating that, you know, as the poem begins, talking about a death in a foreign field, perhaps indicating that shift away from England. But Brooke is quite keen to assert that although somebody's body may rest in a foreign field, their thoughts and minds will be forever under an English heaven. This poem gives a very idealistic depiction of war, completely the opposite of Dulce et Decorum Est. Okay, it is jingoistic in its viewpoint, and this means kind of having an extreme patriotism. Okay, it's what we would call a jingoistic poem, and this is really encapsulated by the final image of an English heaven. Even something abstract and universal such as heaven is described as English. So there is just one more thing I wanted to speak about with regards to the sonnet form in The Soldier. Now, as you are aware, sonnets are 14 lines long, and most of the time they are divided up into an octave, which is the first 8 lines, and a sestet, which is the final 6 lines. Now, we've spoken about the way in which the ideas in Sonnet 43 are sequenced, almost as a kind of question and answer format. But what Brooke does in The Soldier is essentially spend the first octave, the first 8 lines, bigging up England and speaking about how England has enriched his life. And then in the final sestet, he contemplates how his death as a soldier, as a defender of England, will essentially return those gifts given to him by his country. Now, although the tone of the poem is quite confident and assured throughout, there is a more reflective tone in this final sestet and in the second stanza. And this is where we start to see some of the more glorified and idealized versions of death start to come into the poem. So just remember, this all adds to the jingoistic and extremely patriotic nature of the poem. I hope this has helped somewhat, and good luck with the rest of your studying.